In the early hours before dawn breaks across the American heartland, a quiet truth hides beneath the glow of skyscrapers and the calm hum of the financial world. For decades, people across the country trusted their banks, trusted the smiling suits behind the counters, trusted the complex world that promised safety, security, and a future worth investing in. But lurking beneath that trust was a story so enormous, so tangled in greed, power, and backroom decisions, that hardly anyone noticed what was happening until it was far too late. This is the story of how the American banking system, once a symbol of national strength, was quietly cracked open from the inside by deregulation, corruption, and influence so massive that it nearly brought the economy to its knees. A story about how taxpayers, hard-working families, and everyday citizens ended up paying a staggering price, $160 billion, not because of a natural disaster, not because of war, not because of any unavoidable crisis, but because of choices made behind mahogany doors and marble walls. Choices rooted in profit, arrogance, and the belief that the rules would never apply to the powerful. Imagine an America where the banks weren't just financial institutions but untouchable fortresses, protected by politicians, shielded by lobbyists, and fueled by an unstoppable wave of deregulation. Picture the growing tension in the air as the 1980s dawned, a decade defined by promises of prosperity, free markets, and the belief that less regulation meant more opportunity. But hidden beneath the glittering surface of booming real estate, exploding credit markets, and expanding financial freedom was a slow-burning fuse that no one wanted to acknowledge. It all began with the savings and loan industry, a once stable pillar of the American financial system. For decades, savings and loan associations, often called S&Ls, were predictable, conservative, and deeply woven into the fabric of American communities. Their mission was simple: take deposits from families, pay modest interest, and use that money to provide mortgages for ordinary Americans chasing the dream of homeownership. For years, this slow and steady model worked. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. But the economic landscape was shifting, inflation was rising, interest rates were climbing, and the promise of steady, controlled growth no longer appealed to those who saw a chance to transform a quiet, humble industry into a gold rush. Bankers saw an opportunity, politicians saw campaign money, lobbyists saw a chance to rewrite the rules, and together they began to push for the deregulation that would eventually open the floodgates. It started, like many great disasters do, not with a loud bang, but with a quiet whisper, a minor legislative change here, a loosened restriction there. Nothing drastic at first, nothing that set off alarms. In fact, much of the public welcomed these changes, believing that the financial world was simply modernizing. But beneath the surface, the foundations began to shake as regulators lost their grip and oversight weakened. And once the doors were opened, they couldn't be closed again. Suddenly, savings and loan institutions, once limited to safe, traditional investments, were allowed to take massive financial risks. They could invest in commercial real estate. They could gamble in markets they had no business entering. They could make enormous loans, chase enormous profits, and dive headfirst into speculative ventures that had the potential to generate returns far beyond anything their conservative predecessors had ever imagined. And they did exactly that. The industry exploded. Hundreds of new S&Ls were formed, many run not by experienced bankers, but by businessmen, developers, and opportunists who saw dollar signs where others saw danger. The new rules encouraged the bold and rewarded the reckless. Money flowed like water. Real estate projects that had little chance of success received millions in financing. Luxury complexes, grand developments, and speculative ventures ballooned across the country, fueled by easy loans and blind optimism. It was a party, a big, loud, extravagant party, and everyone wanted a seat at the table. The profits were enormous, the risks were invisible, and as long as asset prices kept rising, as long as borrowers kept borrowing, and as long as regulators looked the other way, the system appeared stronger than ever. But it was all a facade. Behind the curtain lay billions of dollars in bad loans, inflated property values, and institutions drowning in debt. Banks reported fake profits to keep investors confident. Executives paid themselves bonuses based on numbers that were little more than illusions. Politicians accepted campaign contributions from the same bankers they were supposed to oversee. Regulators, underfunded and politically pressured, turned a blind eye. And the American taxpayer, completely unaware, was slowly being positioned to absorb the cost of the inevitable collapse. Meanwhile, inside boardrooms across the country, decisions were being made that would shape the future of the crisis. Investments grew larger, the risks grew more extreme, and the illusion of prosperity spread like wildfire. The financial bubble expanded, rising higher and higher, while the cracks beneath it grew wider every day. In California, Texas, and Florida states, where the S&L boom was at its most explosive, banks transformed from humble community institutions into aggressive financial giants. They financed shopping malls, skyscrapers, luxury resorts, and housing developments that stood half empty. They threw money at projects without asking whether they were sustainable. They issued loans knowing the borrowers would never repay them, because, in the new deregulated world, profit today mattered more than consequences tomorrow. Executives bought private jets, yachts, and mansions using bank funds. Some S&Ls became breeding grounds for fraud and outright criminal activity. Money laundering surged, organized crime infiltrated banks, developers colluded with bankers, loans were issued to friends, relatives, or shell companies that existed only on paper. In some cases, banks lent money to businesses they knew were failing just to inflate their books for a few more months, and through it all, the warnings were ignored. Economists raised concerns, whistleblowers spoke out. A handful of regulators begged Congress for more oversight and resources. But deregulation had become a political promise, a badge of honor, a core belief that fewer rules meant more growth. Politicians championed the idea that the free market would take care of itself. The banking industry insisted the crisis was exaggerated, and the media, dazzled by the booming financial markets, offered little scrutiny. The bubble grew and grew and grew, until one day it burst. It didn't happen in one single moment, but in stages, slow at first, then all at once. Property values began to fall. Borrowers defaulted. The enormous loans made on shaky real estate suddenly became worthless. Banks that had looked profitable only months earlier were now exposed as hollow shells filled with bad debt. Executives panicked, regulators scrambled, investors fled, and the truth was impossible to hide any longer. Hundreds of S&Ls were insolvent. The damage wasn't a few $billion, it was catastrophic. Entire regions were hit by waves of bankruptcies. Investors lost everything. Borrowers were crushed. Tens of thousands of people lost homes, jobs, and life savings. And the government faced a crisis so large that it threatened to drag down the entire financial system. There was only one option left: a taxpayer-funded bailout. The bill, $160 billion. Money that came not from the bankers who caused the disaster, not from the politicians who encouraged deregulation, not from the lenders who profited from risky speculation. The bill was handed directly to the American people: teachers, nurses, factory workers, farmers, truck drivers, waitresses, small business owners, all forced to cover the cost of a crisis they never created. And even as the bailout was underway, many of the same executives who had driven their banks into the ground walked away wealthy. Some escaped prosecution. Others settled for fines that barely scratched the surface of what they had stolen. The industry that had promised prosperity delivered devastation instead, and the political system that should have protected the public had allowed the disaster to unfold in plain sight. But make no mistake, this wasn't just a story about economics. It was a story about power, about who benefits when regulations are stripped away, about what happens when profit is placed above responsibility, about a system built to protect the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. And it wasn't the last time. Because the savings and loan crisis didn't simply end with a bailout. It created a blueprint, a warning that the country ignored again and again. A pattern that would repeat in different forms. The dot-com bubble, the 2008 financial crisis, the housing collapse, and the rising risk in today's banking world. Each disaster built on the lessons of the last. Each one rooted in the same hunger for deregulation, the same trust in markets that could not govern themselves, the same belief that nothing could go wrong. But before those later crises were even imaginable, the S&L meltdown stood as one of the largest financial disasters in American history. A heist disguised as policy. A robbery carried out in boardrooms instead of dark alleys. A silent theft from the pockets of millions who never saw it coming. And as the dust settled, one truth became undeniable: when regulation disappears, when powerful institutions write their own rules, when profit is allowed to outrun accountability, the American taxpayer will always be the one left holding the bill. This is only the beginning. The deeper corruption, the political deals, the cover-ups, the hearings, the criminal networks, the untold scandals, all of that is coming next. The collapse of the savings and loan industry wasn't just a financial disaster. It was the anatomy of a nationwide crime scene, but this crime wasn't built with guns or masks. It was built with pens, papers, legislation, and millions of signatures on loans that never should have existed. What unfolded next was a slow, painful excavation of corruption so widespread that even seasoned investigators were stunned. As the crisis deepened, regulators finally began to examine the books of failing institutions, and what they found was far worse than mismanagement. The numbers told a story of intentional deception, phony profits, inflated assets, fabricated loan values, and a mountain of debt hidden beneath creative accounting tricks. S&Ls had disguised their reality behind layers of false reporting, manipulating valuations and burying their losses under optimistic projections that had no connection to the real world. In Texas, entire banks were discovered to be nothing more than personal piggy banks for their executives. Millions of dollars were diverted into private companies, luxury jets, and questionable real estate ventures that existed only on paper. In California, S&ELS financed skyscrapers based on imaginary future leases. In Florida, Developers took loans for resorts and condominiums that were never completed, leaving behind empty shells of buildings baking under the sun. At first, investigators assumed these were isolated cases of few reckless bankers, but as they dug deeper, the pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a handful of bad actors. This was an entire industry operating under the assumption that the rules no longer applied to them. And for a while, they weren't wrong. The deregulation wave of the 1980s had created a world where oversight had no teeth. Penalties were minimal, and the chase for profit was encouraged at every level of government. The more investigators discovered, the clearer it became that political influence had played a crucial role in enabling the chaos. Lawmakers who championed the deregulation were the same people receiving campaign donations from bankers desperate to keep their newfound freedom. Lobbyists representing the savings and loan industry roamed Capitol Hill with briefcases full of promises and contributions, urging Congress to expand deregulation even further. When early warnings reached Washington, they were downplayed or dismissed. Regulators who raised concerns found their budgets cut. Those who pushed a hard-faced political pressure. Those who insisted the system was breaking were ignored because believing them would have required taking action, and action meant challenging some of the most powerful interests in the country. One of the most shocking examples of this political entanglement emerged with the so-called Keating Five. This was a group of influential United States senators accused of pressuring federal regulators to overlook wrongdoing at Lincoln Savings and Loan, one of the most notorious institutions in the entire crisis. Charles Keating, the charismatic and ruthless CEO behind Lincoln, was a master of manipulating both financial systems and political connections. He donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to politicians. He funded campaigns, hosted events, and built relationships with senators who would later intervene on his behalf. When regulators attempted to stop Lincoln's reckless investments and fraudulent practices, Keating enlisted his powerful allies. They confronted federal regulators in private meetings, questioning their motives and pushing them to ease their scrutiny. Those senators insisted they were merely advocating for a constituent. History would reveal they were shielding one of the most corrupt bankers of the era. Lincoln Savings and Loan eventually collapsed, leaving more than 20,000 elderly investors with nothing but worthless bonds and empty promises. Many had entrusted their life savings to Keating's institution because they believed in the system, believed their government would protect them, believed the brochures and smiling executives. What they got instead was a betrayal that shattered their financial futures. And Lincoln was just one example. Across the country, similar stories emerged. Executives who had gambled with depositors' money walked away with millions in bonuses and severance packages. Developers who built half-finished projects vanished into foreign countries, leaving behind empty land and unpaid loans. Brokers who pushed risky investments faced no consequences. Companies declared bankruptcy while their leaders celebrated on private yachts. As the media finally began to shine a light on the scandal, public anger grew. The idea that ordinary Americans would now have to foot the bill for this disaster sparked outrage. Families who had struggled to save money, who paid their taxes, who believed in the integrity of the economy were now being told that they would cover the losses created by greed and negligence. The government scrambled to respond. Hearings were held, politicians took to the microphone, expressing shock and disappointment, promising reform, promising justice. But behind closed doors, the reality was far more complicated. The financial system was so deeply entangled with political interests that unraveling the truth felt nearly impossible. Inside congressional chambers, testimony after testimony painted a devastating picture. Former SNL executives described a culture where making money by any means necessary was not only tolerated but celebrated. Regulators admitted they lacked the resources and political independence to do their jobs. Economists warned that the crisis was the predictable outcome of deregulation combined with reckless speculation. Some of the most chilling revelations came from whistleblowers, low-level bank employees who had watched the collapse unfold from inside the machine. They described being pressured to alter loan documents, inflate collateral values, and approve projects that were doomed from the moment the ink dried. They spoke of executives who openly bragged about manipulating regulators, who laughed at the thought of taxpayer bailouts, who saw the entire system as a game they could win simply by bending the rules until they snapped. As the hearings dragged on, it became clear that the crisis was not just financial, it was moral. It reflected a shift in American business culture where ethics had taken a backseat to profit, where responsibility had evaporated, and where powerful institutions operated without fear of consequences. The government created the Resolution Trust Corporation, an emergency agency tasked with cleaning up the wreckage. Its mission was to take over failed banks, sell their assets, and minimize the financial damage. But even with thousands of employees, billions in funding, and years of effort, the RTC couldn't fully contain the devastation. The cost ballooned far beyond initial estimates. Every passing month revealed more bad loans, more fraud, more corruption, more losses. While the RTC worked to dismantle failed institutions, the impact on ordinary Americans spread like shockwaves. Housing prices collapsed in regions hit hardest by the S&L failures. Construction projects halted mid-development, leaving behind empty steel frames and abandoned concrete foundations that became symbols of a greed-driven collapse. Local businesses that relied on banking stability closed their doors. Schools lost funding. Public services were cut. People lost their jobs. Entire communities faced economic ruin. And yet, through all of this, many of the worst offenders escaped real accountability. Some paid minor fines. Some served short sentences. Others simply moved on, launching new businesses, writing books, appearing on television, and reinventing themselves as brilliant entrepreneurs who had just been ahead of their time. The same deregulation that caused the crisis did not disappear. Instead, it laid the foundation for future disasters. Financial industries learned a dangerous lesson. If things go wrong, the government will bail them out. Bankers learned that risk could be transferred to the public. Politicians learned that campaign donations came easiest from wealthy financial players. And Americans learned that the system did not always protect them. But the true tragedy was not just the financial loss, it was the erosion of trust. Trust in banks, trust in politicians, trust in regulators, trust in the very idea that the system was designed to safeguard ordinary people rather than exploit them. As the S&L crisis became yesterday's news, the country moved forward, new headlines took over, the economy bounced back. People rebuilt their lives, but beneath the surface, a dangerous architecture remained intact, one built on the same cracks that had caused the collapse, and those cracks would widen again in the years to come. But before the next financial disaster would strike, the country still had one more chapter to write about: the savings and loan crisis. The final confrontation, the final revelations, the last wave of investigations, cover-ups and political fallout, because the story was not finished. Not yet. Thanks for watching. And be sure to subscribe for our next episode where we'll uncover the final chapter. When the dust settled from the savings and loan collapse, America found itself staring at a financial battlefield. Empty buildings, broken promises, and shattered communities littered the landscape, and taxpayers were left carrying a burden they never asked for. But what came next wasn't just a cleanup, it was a reckoning, and it would reveal secrets, scandals, and political consequences that stretched far beyond the banking world. In Washington, the pressure to hold someone accountable grew unbearable. Citizens wanted justice. Investigators wanted answers. Families whose life savings had evaporated wanted closure. Congress, facing a nation of angry voters, launched deeper, more aggressive inquiries. But what these hearings uncovered would shock even the most seasoned political observers. Behind closed doors, lawmakers confronted a truth they never wanted to admit: they had helped create the disaster. For years, powerful politicians from both parties had accepted campaign contributions from bankers who begged for deregulation. Many of those same lawmakers had voted for the very laws that allowed S&Ls to gamble with taxpayer-insured deposits. Some had even pressured regulators to back off investigations to protect their donors. Others simply turned a blind eye while financial institutions collapsed under the weight of their own corruption. As these revelations came to light, several politicians found themselves directly implicated. Private meetings they claimed were harmless suddenly looked very different. Investigators uncovered internal memos, handwritten notes, and witness testimonies revealing that those meetings were part of a coordinated effort to protect some of the most fraudulent institutions in the entire crisis. The Keating 5 scandal, once seen as a political embarrassment, now appeared to be part of a much bigger pattern, one where bankers used influence not just to shape policy but to block investigations, silence whistleblowers, and protect their own fortunes. Throughout the hearings, senators and congressmen scrambled to distance themselves from the mess. Some blamed regulators, others blamed economic conditions. A few blamed the banks themselves, but almost none took responsibility for the decisions that allowed the collapse to unfold. Meanwhile, federal investigators continued to uncover cases of outright fraud so bold they seemed pulled from a Hollywood screenplay. At one failed S&L, executives had shredded thousands of pages of evidence the night before regulators arrived, leaving only fragments of financial statements scattered across warehouse floors. At another, the CEO secretly funneled millions into offshore accounts, then escaped to a Caribbean island where he lived comfortably for years before finally being extradited. In Texas, a group of real estate developers had used S&L loans to finance entire chains of luxury properties. When the market collapsed, they abandoned every single project, leaving empty concrete towers standing like monuments to greed. But even as investigators tried to untangle these crimes, the complexity of the crisis worked in favor of the guilty. Many cases were too massive, too tangled, and too expensive to prosecute. Evidence was missing. Paper trails were incomplete. Witnesses had vanished. The legal system found itself overwhelmed by the sheer scale of wrongdoing, and so, while some high-profile bankers faced charges, most escaped real punishment. A handful were convicted, and a few served prison time, but many more simply paid fines, declared bankruptcy, or walked away from the ruins with millions still hidden in their pockets. Justice came slowly and unevenly, But the story didn't end with courtroom battles. It extended into the daily lives of millions of ordinary Americans who faced the long-term consequences. Entire neighborhoods found themselves frozen in decline. Construction sites stood abandoned for years, their skeletal frames casting long shadows across empty streets. Families who had saved for decades discovered their investments were worthless. Small towns lost their banks, their employers, and their futures all at once. Farmers were unable to secure loans for planting season. Teachers watched school budgets shrink. Local governments faced enormous deficits as property values collapsed. And families who had once believed that homeownership was the cornerstone of the American dream now watched foreclosure signs spread across their communities like an epidemic. Perhaps the most devastating legacy of the savings and loan disaster was what it taught the financial world. It taught banks that risk could be transferred to the taxpayer. It taught corporations that political donations could reshape entire industries. It taught investors that regulators could be influenced if the price was right. And it taught the nation that when the powerful make mistakes, the people will always pay. That lesson would come back again and again. A little more than a decade later, the dot-com bubble blew open from reckless speculation. Then came 2008, when the housing market, fueled by deregulation, risky loans, and fraud, collapsed and triggered the Great Recession. Once again, banks were bailed out. Once again, taxpayers footed the bill. Once again, the system protected those at the top. The truth, as history revealed, was simple. The savings and loan crisis was not an isolated event. It was a warning, a bright, flashing red light that America ignored. A message that deregulation without accountability was not freedom, it was a gateway to disaster. And a reminder that when the lines between government, money, and power blur, corruption becomes almost inevitable. In the end, the S&L collapse became one of the most expensive financial failures in American history. More than 1,000 institutions failed. The bailout cost reached over $160 billion, and the ripple effects shaped the country for decades. But the real cost cannot be measured in dollars. It can be measured in trust that was lost, broken, and never fully restored. Trust in banks, trust in regulators, trust in politicians, trust in a system that was supposed to protect the people, not betray them. As America moved forward, the lessons of the past remained buried beneath new policies, new crises, new headlines. But the story of the great American bank heist still echoes, reminding us that the most dangerous crimes are not always committed in the shadows. Sometimes, they are committed in the spotlight by the people with the most power, the most money, and the least accountability. And if history teaches us anything, it's that the cost of ignoring these warnings will always, eventually, fall on the shoulders of the American people. The story ends here, but the consequences never did. Thank you for watching. If you found this story important, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world.